There was a woman who came to the Dry Hill farm with $25, 80 starving hogs, and nothing else she could call her own. There was a woman who came to the Dry Hill farm, the end of a summer, that had cracked the earth like old pottery, and the man who would change everything was the last person anyone in Harrow Flats expected to offer her. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? The hill country west of Harrow Flats had not seen rain worth speaking of in 14 months. The creek beds were pale and skeletal, showing their white gravel ribs like something long dead. The grasses along the road had gone the color of old straw, and the dust that rose when a wagon passed hung in the still air for minutes before settling, as if even gravity had grown tired in the heat. It was into this landscape, pale gold and bone white and the particular gray-brown of exhausted soil, that Mira Aldenvoss came driving a hired cart with 80 hogs she had purchased for 25. That was the full sum recorded in the ledger of Cutter's stockyard on the 14th day of August. 80 hogs, variously aged from 6 weeks to 3 years, purchased by one Mira Aldenvoss, half-orc by registry, late of the eastern provinces, resident of nowhere in particular at the time of sale. The stock agent had written the word half-orc in the margin beside her name as if it were relevant to the transaction. It was not. What was relevant was that the hogs were half-starved, that their previous keeper had given up on them in the drought and priced them accordingly, and that Mira had seen something in them that most reasonable people in Harrow Flats would not have seen. She had looked at 80 thin, dusty, miserable animals and looked at the dry hill country beyond the stockyard fence, and something had moved through her mind the way certainty sometimes moves, quiet and whole, without the noise of argument. She had not told anyone what she saw. That was her way. She was 31 years old. She stood a hand taller than most women in the county, and a shade taller than most men, which was common enough for someone of her parentage. Her tusks were modest, lower ones only, and she kept her dark hair braided back in a practical knot. Her hands were large and calloused across the palm in the specific pattern of sustained physical labor across many years. She had gray-green eyes that processed things thoroughly before they let anything back out, which some people read as slowness and others, more correctly, read as care. With her on the cart were her 2 children. Bryn was 9 years old, quiet and watchful, in the way of children who have learned that the adult world requires monitoring. She sat with her knees together and her eyes moving between the road ahead and her mother's face, reading the two the way a sailor reads water and sky together for the full picture. Pip was 5, full orc by registry, which she did not know and would not have understood, and she sat with her legs dangling off the back of the cart, counting the hogs in a continuous murmur that never quite reached 80 because she lost her place somewhere in the 50s and started over. She had been counting since the stockyard. She had not yet reached 80 once. The farm had been described to Mira in a single sentence by a woman at the dry goods store. Up the west road past the 2 dead oaks, left at the stone fence. And it belongs to the Voss man, now the quiet one. He won't bother you, but he won't help you either, so. Mira had thanked her, bought 3 pounds of salt pork and a bag of cornmeal, and put the directions away in her mind where she kept things that mattered. The farm appeared when she turned at the stone fence. It sat at the end of a track between 2 long fields that were now just dry ground with the pale ghosts of grasses in them. The farmhouse was low and made of dark timber, with a porch along the front and a barn set back to the left, and behind the barn something that caught Mira's attention the way a sound catches the ear before the mind has named it. Not the dusty, half-alive green of plants merely surviving, a particular deep, saturated green that meant something specific to someone who knew how to look. She studied it while the cart rolled to a stop in the yard. The man came out of the barn before she had climbed down. Edan Voss was 43 years old. He moved with the deliberate weight of someone who had done the same physical tasks in the same order, long enough that his body had organized itself around them. His hair was the gray-brown of dried cedar, and he wore it short. His face was weathered in the symmetrical way of consistent outdoor work. He had a woodworking tool in his right hand that he had not thought to set down, and his left hand hung at his side, doing nothing. The particular posture of a man who had once reached for someone with that hand, and he looked at the cart, he looked at the hogs, he looked at Mira. He did not look at her tusks or perform any of the assessments the county assumed were appropriate at a glance. He looked at her eyes and at her hands, which were still holding the reins. She said, "I was told you might lease a field." He said, "I might." She said, "I have 80 hogs, and I need to run them on ground where they can work. $6 a month for the north field and water rights. If you have water, I can pay in labor instead. If that works better." He was quiet for 3 seconds. The hogs made sounds. Pip had lost count again and started over. He said, "There's water. Spring-fed, back behind the north field. It didn't dry up this summer." Mira looked at the green behind the barn. She said, "I know." He studied her. She studied him. Bryn watched them both. He said, $6 a month, field and water rights. I'll include the north paddock and the lean-to at the fence line for storing feed." She said, "That's more than I asked for," he said. She climbed down and held out her right hand, and he shook it. His grip was even, not testing, not performative, just the grip of a man who had decided something and was not going to make drama of it. She made camp in the lean-to the first night with the children, and a bedroll each, and a small iron pan over a fire built from deadfall. She cooked the salt pork with cornmeal, and they ate from the pan in turns. Pip ate with great enthusiasm and named the hogs by number, occasionally revising the assignments without explanation. Bryn ate methodically and said almost nothing. But before she lay down, she looked at the barn in the middle distance and the light still showing under the door, and she said, "He works late." Mira said, Bryn said, "Is that good or bad?" Mira said, "It's just true." She lay awake after the girls were asleep. The hogs made the small, settled sounds of animals that had found water and were not frightened. The spring behind the north field moved through the dark with a sound she could just barely hear, faint and consistent, like something alive and patient. She lay still and thought about things she had not yet had the space to think about. She was 31 years old with $25 invested in 80 thin hogs on leased land, her children beside her, and nothing else. The only thing she felt listening to that distant water was a very careful, very provisional kind of hope. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you hold lightly and don't speak aloud. Just water, just a field, just ground where her hogs could work, and a spring the drought had not touched in the first week. The hogs went to work in the north field the way hogs work, thoroughly, unsupplely, enormously, Effectively, they rooted. They turned the dry, crusted soil with their snouts and hooves in a continuous, slow overturning that began to change the character of the ground even before rain fell. They found things in the soil a person walking across it would not have suspected: old roots, buried organic matter, pockets of moisture that had survived the summer below the cracked surface. They were thin animals doing the work of their nature, and they did it with the focused industry of creatures that have found purpose and water in the same place. Mira worked beside them. She moved the temporary fencing each day in a planned rotation, drawn out on a piece of paper in the lean-to. She hauled water from the spring in a yoke and 2 buckets. 14 trips in the morning, 12 in the evening, account her body. Knew precisely she mended fencing where it sagged. She documented the weight of the hogs in a ledger, measuring their condition against the previous weeks. On the 7th day, the average weight of the 80 animals had increased by an estimated 3 pounds each, which is what consistent water and the freedom to forage will do for a thin animal in less time than most people expect. Ednon observed from a distance in those first days, not in a surveillant way, but because his own work on the farm sometimes brought him near enough to see. He noted the rotation plan, the ledger, the yoke, and the count of trips to the spring. On the 8th day, he appeared at the lean-to, with a second cistern on a handcart recently patched, and said, "This will hold enough for 2 days' watering. I'll fill it from the spring with the pump. You won't need the yoke." Mira said, "That's not in the lease." He said, "Consider it adjacent to the lease." She said, "I don't need adjacent arrangements. I can manage the yoke." He said, "I know you can. The cistern is better for the spring. If you draw slower, it has time to replenish properly." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "All right." He left the cistern and went back to his work. She stood looking at it in the morning light, this patched and repaired thing made useful again, and thought something she did not say, which was that she had not been given a practical thing by a person without a catch behind it in a very long time. By the end of the 4th week, the hogs were visibly different animals. They had gained weight steadily. Their coats changed from the dull, dry bristle of deprivation to something with more texture and life in it. The rooting in the section nearest the spring had begun to expose what Mira had suspected: a secondary seam of moisture running through the upper soil, following the spring's underground course. On the 26th day, the hogs worked that section and exposed a small secondary source. Not a spring exactly, but a weeping of water from the soil that filled a low hollow at a rate of perhaps 3 gallons an hour, consistent. Reliable. It meant something important about the depth and breadth of the water below the north field. She went to find Idan that evening. He was in the barn, 2 lanterns burning amber, the smell of resin and sawdust and oil, worked into old wood. He made things. A chair stood, half-completed on a workbench, its joints cut with visible precision, its lines clean and considered. On a shelf behind him were boxes, a clock case, a set of handles waiting for their blades. And on a separate shelf, set slightly apart, covered with a cloth too deliberately placed to be a dust cloth, was the shape of a sewing basket with a hinged lid. She did not look at the sewing basket, she looked at the chair. She said, "There's a secondary source in the north field. The hogs opened it today. It's weeping from the soil. At about 3 gallons an hour. If you ran a drain from the low hollow toward the south field, you'd have water for a second rotation." He set down his tool. He said, "How long were you looking for it?" She said, "Since the first week, the grasses showed it." The hogs confirmed it. He said, "I farmed this land for 9 years." She said, "I'm not saying you missed it. I'm saying the drought changed the surface enough to make it visible, and the hogs found it. It's your land. I'm telling you because it's useful information." He said, "Thank you." She turned to go. She had nearly cleared the doorway when he said, "Have you eaten today?" She stopped. He said, "It's past 7 in the evening." She said, "We're fine." He said, "I made too much stew. It's on the stove. There are bowls on the left shelf." She stood in the doorway for a moment with her back to him. Then she went inside and took 3 portions back to the lean-to in a covered pot she borrowed without asking. She fed the girls and then ate herself, sitting outside in the cooling dark with the sounds of the hogs and the distant water. And the night was several degrees cooler than it had been a week ago, and somewhere in the county the air had shifted in the specific way that sometimes it rained on the 1st of September. Not the brief spitting of moisture that raises dust and achieves nothing, but real rain. 6 hours of it, beginning at 4 in the morning, the kind the cracked earth resists for the first 30 minutes before water finds the openings and begins to move through. The north field, broken up by 5 weeks of hog work, absorbed the rain differently from the surrounding land. It took it in quickly, evenly, like ground that had been prepared to receive. Mira stood in the rain in the north field and watched the water move and felt something she was careful not to name too specifically. Edan stood 20 feet away watching the same thing. They had both come out when the rain started, as farmers do, and they had both ended up here, because this was where the thing worth watching was. They stood in the rain a reasonable distance apart and said nothing for a long time, and that silence was comfortable in a way that silences between 2 near strangers. Finally, Mira said, "The weight of the herd should reach break-even by end of October. After that, each week, they gain as profit on the original 25. Said, "What will you do with the profit?" She said, "Buy 2 animals for every 3 I sell. Keep the rotation going through winter. If you'll continue the lease, by spring both fields will be turned, and the secondary source established." He said, "You planned all of this before you came here." She said, "I planned the hogs. The land showed me the rest." He said nothing to that. Pip appeared in the lean-to doorway, delighted by the rain, and Bryn appeared behind her and pulled her back inside. Edan watched this and then looked at the ground again. He said, "The house has 3 rooms that aren't mine. You're welcome to them for the winter. I'll adjust the lease to include it." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because a lean-to in winter is inadequate. Because the house is empty rooms. Because the reasons for not offering it are smaller than the reasons for offering it." She said, "I don't want charity." He said, "I know that. Room and board counted against labor or against the monthly rate." She stood in the rain while Pip got free of Bryn's hold and ran into the yard anyway, laughing, face turned up to the water. Mira said, "Counted against labor." He said, "Fine, that was the arrangement. That was how it started, not with sentiment, not with anything anyone could have pointed to and named. Just the adjustment of a lease. Just 3 empty rooms in a house that had been too quiet for 9 years, and a woman who had been too cold and too careful for longer than that, and 2 children who ran in the rain and counted hogs and watched everything. The weeks that followed had the quality of water finding its level. Nobody decided anything. Mira cooked in the mornings because she rose earliest, and the stove was there, and it was efficient to feed the household, while the fire was already going. Eden came in from the early barn work, ate what she had made, said it was good, and she nodded, and that was all. Bren began helping Eden barn on afternoons when there was no fence mending to be done. Not because anyone suggested it, but because she had been watching the woodworking from the doorway for 2 weeks. And one afternoon he had simply set a piece of wood on a lower workbench and put a plane beside it and gone back to his own work. And Bryn had come in and picked up the plane and learned what it was for by trying it. She had a good eye and patient hands. He told her so after the first week. She received this without smiling, the way children receive truths about themselves they already knew, but had not been confirmed. Pip named every hog. She revised the names frequently and updated Eden on the changes at dinner, with the gravity of official correspondence. The sewing basket on the shelf, Mira noticed it again in the second week she slept in the house. The cloth was still on it, still deliberately placed. She did not ask about it. She understood, in the way one person who has learned to carry things quietly understands another, that the basket was a kind of compass point. It told you where north was for Eden Voss. It told you that he had loved someone and that she had been gone long enough for dust to settle on a covering cloth, and not long enough to put the basket away. It told you what not to touch and what not to need from him. Yet she respected it. She set back the book she had borrowed and said nothing. But she noticed, perhaps 3 weeks later, that the cloth on the basket had been straightened and redraped, not removed, but tended, as if someone had decided that the thing it covered deserved to be kept with care rather than just kept. She did not comment. She noted it in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. It was in the second month, on an evening in late October, that Mira sat at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, and told Eden what had brought her here. Not all of it at once. In the way that true things come out when the context is safe enough, piece by piece. Without a performance of telling. She had been married for 8 years. His name was not worth saying, she said. He had been a man who understood, with the specific intelligence of that kind of person, how to use the things available to him. The registry column that said half-orc. The county customs that governed what she could own. The way a particular kind of man in a particular kind of community can frame a woman's practical competence as suspicious, and her pride as dangerous, and her children as instruments. He had used all of these things with patience and with the public face of a reasonable, concerned husband. She said, he never broke anything visible. She paused. Eden said nothing. She said, he had a way of explaining me to other people that made me smaller every time. After 6 years, I had started to believe his explanations. I forgot that I had ever looked at an animal or a piece of ground and known something about it. I forgot I had ever been certain about anything. She said, the $25 was the last of a savings I had kept for 4 years in a seam in a winter coat. He didn't know about the coat. It was the only thing he didn't know about. She said, I took the girls and the coat and walked out on a Tuesday morning in July, while he was in the village. I bought the hogs because I was standing at the stockyard fence, and I looked at 80 miserable animals, and I remembered that I knew things. I remembered that I was good at this. She stopped. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, the night was the cool, dense dark of a hill country October, and the hogs were settled, and the water moved along the drain channel with the patient consistency of something that had always been there. Eden said, "You were right about the hogs." She said, "I know." He said, "And the ground." She said, "Yes." He said, "He'll come looking." She said, "He already knows where I am. He's been in Harrow Flats for a week. I've been waiting for him to come out here, and I don't know why he's waiting." Eden looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "He's waiting because he wants witnesses." She understood immediately that he was right. This was the kind of man who needed an audience for his reasonableness, who needed to be seen performing his patience and his legitimate concern, who would arrive not in anger, but in a carefully managed version of regret, designed to look like love and function like a legal instrument. Eden said, "I know a man in the county records office. I know the woman who runs the cooperative. I know 3 families along the West Road who have watched what you've done to that north field in 10 weeks, and who are not fools." He said nothing else. He did not say, "I will stand with you or you are not alone." He said the names of people who existed and who knew true things. He said it the way he made furniture, with clean joints and considered lines and nothing unnecessary. She said, "All right." She went to bed. She lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, and the hogs breathe and the drain channel run, and she thought about what it felt like to have someone know the shape of the threat and answer it with names. Names. People. Evidence. The materials of the thing rather than the sentiment of it. He came on a Thursday morning in the first week of November, which was colder now. The hills brown and rust-colored. The sky a pale, washed-out blue. He came in a hired carriage with a county man beside him, dressed well, with papers, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been patient to the edge of reasonableness and now has no choice but to act. His name was Corlin Marsh. He was 39 years old, and not physically imposing. His power had never been physical. It had always been administrative, social, relational, the kind built in meeting rooms and at bar counters by a man who understood how to make a community's existing prejudices do work for him. He stood in the yard and said, loudly enough for the field and the road, "To hear, Mira, I've come because I'm worried about you and the girls." She was in the north field. She came out deliberately, not hurrying, with her ledger under one arm and mud on her boots, and stood on the farm side of the fence and looked at him. She said, "What do you want, Corlin?" He said, "I want to talk about the children. I want to understand why you left without speaking to me and give you the chance to come home." He said all of this reasonably at full volume, performing for the carriage man, and for any neighbors within hearing. The papers in his hand he had not produced yet, which meant they were for later, after the reasonableness had been established. Mira said, "The children are well," he said. "I'd like to see them." She said no. He said, "Mira, I have a legal right, as their father." She said, "Pip is not your daughter." This landed in the yard and stayed there. He had not expected her to say it plainly in the open with the county man beside him. He adjusted quickly, which he was skilled at. He said, I've raised her as my own for 5 years." She said, "You've registered her as full orc in the county ledger, and used that registration to argue she was a liability rather than a dependent in every property dispute we've had for 5 years. That's in the records." She had copies because Edan's friend at the county records office was a thorough woman who liked accurate paperwork and disliked men who used it as a weapon. Corlin's face changed by approximately nothing. But the county man beside him had made a small movement, the kind people make when they hear something that reorganizes a situation they thought they understood. Corlin said, "You're making this difficult when it doesn't need to be." She said, "I'm being specific when specificity is appropriate." He began to speak again, louder now. The volume that was itself characterization, his version of force, and from the direction of the house came the woman who ran the cooperative, whose name was Derry Hallam, 60 years old and shaped like someone who had spent 6 decades being right about practical things. Behind her came a man of about 50 called Seb Gorton, who had farmed the land adjacent to the south field for 20 years, and who had watched the north field change over 10 weeks with the keen attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. Behind him came Edan, who walked without hurrying and stood at a slight remove to Mira's left, behind her, and to the side, which meant beside her, but not in front of her, the right distance. Derry Hallam said to Corlin, without greeting and without raising her voice, "I believe you have papers." "I'd like to see them," Corlin said. "This is a family matter," Derry said. "It's become a community matter." She was very comfortable with this. She had the specific patience of a woman who had run a cooperative for 30 years and had outlasted difficult men through the simple application of stillness. They were a petition for guardianship, citing abandonment, inadequate living conditions, and the influence on the children of an unsanctioned domestic arrangement, which was a phrase that meant Edan. And which was the moment the county man looked at Edan and then at the house and then at the farm, and visibly reconsidered the story he had been told in the carriage. Zeb Gorton looked at the petition and said, in the flat, direct voice of a man who grew things for a living, "I've been farming this county for 20 years. That north field has been dead ground since the drought. This woman turned it in 10 weeks with 80 hogs and found a water source that's running now the children I've seen twice at the dry goods store. And they looked well-fed and clean and said polite things. I don't know what inadequate looks like to you, but it doesn't look like that." Corlin said to the county man specifically, "You can see the situation here. She's placed herself with a man off the registry, and she's using the children too." Mira said, "I am employed here under a lease recorded at the county office on the 24th of August. I am a tenant and a laborer. That is the full nature of the arrangement. You have access to the lease because it is a public record. You read it before you came here, because that is the kind of preparation you make, and you decided not to mention it because it contradicts the story you are telling." She said this at an ordinary volume, without performance, and it was the flattest, most specific, most unmistakably true thing that had been said in the yard all morning. For 3 seconds he was simply a man who had run out of maneuver, a thing she had never seen on his face before, and which was not satisfying in the dramatic way she might once have imagined, but was simply a fact, like the fact of the water in the north field, like the fact of the hog's weight in her ledger. The county man said quietly to Corlin, "I think we should go back to town." Corlin folded the papers. He got into the carriage. He did not look at the children, who were watching from the porch with Bryn's arm around Pip's shoulders. He did not look at the farm or the field or the green that still showed behind the north fence even in November. That deep, particular green of ground with reliable water beneath it. He left without looking back, which was his one honest gesture of the morning. The refusal to perform a backward glance he did not feel. Derry Hallam watched the carriage until it reached the road and turned. Then she looked at Mira and said, "I'll want a full account of those hog rotation figures before spring. I have 3 cooperative members who've been watching that field and asking questions." The county man paused before following and said, "For what it's worth, I'll note in my file that the petition was voluntarily withdrawn. Clean record." She said, "I appreciate that." He left. The yard was quiet. The hogs made their sounds from the paddock. The drain channel ran. The sky had moved from pale blue to the deeper blue of late morning, and the air had the cold, clear quality of a November day. Edan said, "Are you all right?" She said yes. He said, "Good." Pip came off the porch at a run and wrapped both arms around Mira's left leg and said, "Into her coat. Number 47, bit number 12 again." Mira said, "I'll note it in the ledger." Pip said, "I renamed 47. His name is Trouble." Now, Bryn came more slowly from the porch and stopped beside Edan and looked up at him and said, in her precise, deliberate way, "Thank you for the people you brought." He said, "They came because they wanted to." She said, "You asked them." He said yes. She looked at him for a moment with the steady assessment she applied to all things, then gave a single nod, the kind that from Bryn was equivalent to an extensive endorsement. The winter came in over the hill country, and the farm was warm. There were 4 people in a house that had been empty of most of them for 9 years, and the silence that had collected in the corners of the rooms began to disperse, not all at once, but in the gradual, patient way that cold air disperses when a stove is lit and people move through a space with purpose and noise. Pip's voice was in the house. Bryn's quiet presence organized itself into the rhythm of the mornings. Mira came back from walking the field at dawn in the first snow with cold reddened cheeks and sat close to the stove. Eden was in the house in the evenings now, rather than the barn. He worked at the kitchen table sometimes, small pieces fitting and finishing with hand tools while the others were in the room, and this was something he had not done since his wife was alive, and which he had not noticed he had stopped doing until he found himself doing it again. The sewing basket on the shelf was still covered, but beside it in the second week of December, there appeared a small carved piece of oak, the size of a hand, shaped carefully into the form of a hog in mid-root, snout down, flanks round, and content. Mira found it one evening and looked at it for a long time. She did not move it. She set it exactly where it was, beside the covered basket, 2 things together, on a shelf, one old and tended, and one new and offered. She went back to the kitchen and sat down with her ledger. Adan looked at her from across the table. She did not look up, but one side of her mouth moved in a way that on another face would have been a full smile, and on hers was something more precise and more private and considerably more significant. In January, she began to sing when she was alone in the house. Not a performance. The kind of singing that happens when a person has stopped monitoring themselves. Quiet, low, melodic phrases that occurred at the stove or at the table, fragments of a song she had known since childhood. Bryn heard it first. Bryn said nothing about it, but she looked up from her work and listened, and then went back to what she was doing, with a particular quality of stillness that was a kind of relief. Eden heard it on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of January, coming in from the barn with cold hands and wood shavings still on him. He stopped just inside the kitchen door and stood there for perhaps 20 seconds, while she sang quietly over the stove, not knowing she was heard. Then he moved normally through the kitchen to the basin, washed his hands, and sat down. She stopped singing when she became aware of him. He said without looking up, "You don't have to stop." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I know." She did not resume it that morning, because that was not the kind of thing that could be instructed back into being. But over the days that followed, it came back on its own terms, because the conditions were right and the ground was ready, and some things grow when they are allowed to simply grow. In the last week of February, when the herd had reached 93 animals through careful reinvestment, and both fields stood ready for spring work, Eden came in from the barn on a Sunday evening. She said, "I am staying. The lease runs through March." He said, "After March." She looked at him. He said, "I mean permanently. I mean as my wife, if you want that. I mean Bryn and Pip here always. I mean this is your farm, too, by any measurement that matters, by what you've found in this ground and what you've done to it, and what you know about it that I didn't know. For 9 years. I mean all of it." He said this in the direct, unornamented way. He said everything that mattered. And then he was quiet, and let it be. She sat with it. She looked at the ledger and at the cup and at her own hands, large and calloused across the palm, the hands that had held the reins coming into this yard on the 23rd of August, and that had held 131 mornings' worth of yoke. She looked at these hands and thought about what it meant to be asked plainly and without performance, as a specific person for a specific future, by someone who had seen her work and her children and her grief and her certainty, and had not tried to explain any of it as something else. She said yes. He said, "Good." They were married in March, at the county registry, which was a practical location that suited them both. Derry Hallam was there. Seb Gorton was there with his wife. The man from the records office who liked accurate paperwork had arranged to be present in an official capacity not strictly required. Bryn wore a gray dress with a white collar and stood with the formal composure of someone who has decided this is correct and is prepared to defend that position. Pip wore the same dress she wore most days and had named 3 new hogs since breakfast, and introduced Derry Hallam to 2 of them by name before the ceremony began. And Mira, at the registry table, in the plain winter light of a March morning, signed her name in a hand that was steady and clear and entirely her own. She sang at the small dinner Derry organized afterward. Not a performance, just a song that belonged to her, full and unmonitored, with the people she had made into a family seated around a table, and Pip dancing in the corner, with the specific unself-conscious joy of a child who does not know she is doing anything remarkable. Eden listened the way he had listened in January, except this time he did not stop himself from looking at her, and she knew he was looking, and she did not stop. The herd reached 112 animals by April. Both fields were turned and ready for planting in sections between hog rotations, and the secondary source was documented in the county water records as a permanent feature of the land's hydrology, which increased the assessed value of the farm by an amount that made Seb Gorton whistle when he heard it. The spring behind the north field ran, as it had always run, fed from deep old water laid down before any human calculation of drought or plenty, steady and patient and unbothered by surface conditions. The sewing basket stayed on the shelf, covered and tended. The carved hog stayed beside it. In the spring, Mira added a small, pressed wildflower between them, a thing Pip had picked from the south field margin and handed over with no particular ceremony. Mira had pressed it between book pages and placed it there, and Edan had seen it and said nothing, and that nothing was the right answer. The same right answer that land gives when you read it correctly and do what it is already trying to tell you. Some things take root not by replacing what came before, but by growing patient and deep alongside it, until you can no longer tell where the old water ends and the new begins, only that the ground above is green, and the source holds even in the driest summer, and the house is warm, and someone is singing.